I'm Max, and this is my colleague Julz. He actually was supposed to be initially on all of the advertisement, and unfortunately it wasn't, so we'll make up for it.
Just really English, so I don't like to claim credit for anything.
He deserves as much credit as me. The other thing also is Julz just submitted his PhD, so he's going to be a doctor soon, whatever.
Don't jinx it. That is the worst thing that you can say.
But we'll do fine. We'll be pairing on this talk. So the talk today is about the Dojo experience at Pivotal. So we're going to pair on this, and we're going to cover what I think will be an informative talk. And also, we'll try to make sure we get a little bit of time towards the end so you can ask some questions. So let's get started. So the first thing is, of course, a dojo. What is a dojo? It's like if you've done any karate or any martial arts, it's really the space where you go and you learn with masters. So think of it as entering this stage, right? And if you are fans of the Matrix like we are, you can kind of think of the first couple Matrix movies, and it feels somewhat like this. So that's the theme we're going to use. So how do you contribute to Cloud Foundry? If you ask yourself this question, and you want to be more than just a contributor that submits a small PR, you want to have significant impact. How do you do this? And how does your company do it? Well, that's what the Dojo program is for. Of course, people from Pivotal, our colleagues there, would be the best people to talk about what they think the Dojo program is. We were going to give you our experience, our perspective from that dojo, since we both went to it. Okay? And as part of doing this, what we're going to do is to also give you an idea of what does it mean to be agile, especially since we are both from IBM, and we have a perspective of agility from a bigger company. And then we'll end up with some thoughts. So with this, I'm going to pass it to Julian, who's going to take you to the next stage. Julian.
OK, so let's see. So I'm going to try and go super fast, because I think it would be good if you have questions at the end. So if I skip important stuff, write it down. And apologies in advance for the speed. So I just want to set the scene first and just sort of talk in general terms, and then we'll talk about more specifics after that. So does anyone remember extreme programming and Agile and what people thought when all of this started? So if you remember I guess like 10 years or so ago, extreme programming, there was a lot of hoopla and controversy. Is this going to work? Is this a realistic way of building software? Can we really pair program all the time? Is test-first development going to work? Can we really get rid of architecture and documentation, all of these things? And that became Agile, Scrum, all these other ways of building software. I think the real thing is it does work. Like this is something that works. And extreme programming is one side of that. Agile is another. There's more than one way to build a project, but they all have the same goals. We want to maintain quality and build software fast and respond to change. I'm going to talk a little bit about the differences, because I suspect that a lot of people will have more experience with the more big company Agile, that maybe places like IBM, where I work, are used to this style of Agile. And on the Dojo, the style of Agile you see is quite different. It's a much more extreme programming, original form of Agile. And so I want to maybe highlight some of those differences. But keeping in mind, I think these are both things that do actually work quite well in their own contexts. I will also say that this is very much my observations, and it might well not be by the book how things are supposed to work, but this felt like the differences to us. So, big company Agile versus Pivotal Agile. How many, out of interest, how many people in the room sort of use Agile, would describe themselves as using Agile on their projects? Seems like about half. And if you use Agile, by a show of hands, if you use sort of extreme programming style Agile, if you know, or more sort of Scrum style, or more of the new, more big company agile processes. Okay. So I think, so who uses pair programming in the room? Like, do people pair a lot? It's like some, but not a lot. So I think it's fair to say that single coding is kind of the default at the moment. If someone doesn't tell you, they're probably a single coder. And it works okay, but there's a lot of problems with single coding, right? It takes you a long time to come up to speed on a new project. It's sometimes difficult to get knowledge sharing among the team. And I think one thing you notice is it takes a long time to go from being a junior programmer to a senior programmer on a team. Pair programming is a pretty different model. You probably all know about it. In practice, it is a very intense way of coding. I would find that by the end of Friday of a week, I needed my weekend immediately. I had to sleep better than I normally sleep on the weekends. But it's a fantastic way to learn. I think you get to work with lots of smart people each day. And it's very rewarding. You feel like you've achieved something at the end of each day. It's a very intense and rewarding thing to do. But it is probably not for everyone. I think I really enjoyed it. I think a lot of people will really enjoy it. But equally, I don't know that it's something that everyone would enjoy as a way of coding. And I certainly don't think it's the way I always want to write code. There are times when you might not want to. I wonder if people recognize this. This is the sort of the agile style methodology that's not really agile at all, right? It's where you do the exact same thing that you normally do, but you call it agile and you say, the old things are still there, but we call them sprints. I think this is somewhat common. I think test first is getting adopted, but not completely. And what you have to understand, I think, is that the pivotal style is really fully agile. You know, everything is test first. Everything is pair programmed. That's awesome, and that works really well. The flip side of that is sometimes there's some limited amounts of documentation because you don't need it as much when everyone's in the same room and everyone is pairing. And there's a lot of issues where there's a reliance on being in the same room, and it works great, but it might not work for larger contexts. And that's something we might come back to comment on a bit later. So that's the sort of high level of the differences between the two. And now we will talk a little bit about the specifics.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Julz. So if after what Julz mentioned in terms of like differentiating between what you see at your company and what you hear from Pivotal, you feel a little bit like Keanu Reeves in The Matrix like this, that's exactly how you should feel. But in reality, what you're going to see is that it's actually a great way to learn. After a few weeks, you get into it. Okay? So what we're going to do now is to kind of give you an idea of our experiences. And there are some people here I can see, like Matt, director from Pivotal. So hopefully, we can make sure that we address, the things that we learn. And if you have more questions, you can come to us and talk to him as well. So our experience was mostly, and the first thing I should say is that the Dojo program at Pivotal is by invitation. So pretty much you got to get an invitation from Matt or I guess Rob, me, or David Stevenson. But you shouldn't be discouraged from talking to them and seeing if you can get an invitation. But it's by invitation. Once you get an invitation, it's usually 6 to 8 weeks, and you work directly with the team at Pivotal in San Francisco, not too far from here. The other thing I tried to do specifically is to try to work with multiple teams. But typically, you would work with one team to just get a good overview of what that team does. And generally, as Julz mentioned, it's an opportunity to learn. I came in personally in the Cloud Foundry having a lot of experience in software engineering, Agile, and so on, but not a lot in Cloud Foundry per se. So what I wanted to do is to learn the code base, make sure I knew how to debug, because of course that's the first thing you want to do, and be able to set up a system and so on. And then of course contribute, because as you'll hear from anybody at Pivotal, once they put you in, I mean, you're part of the team. You know, you're going to be contributing immediately, and you want to hold your own because your reputation is on the line and your company's reputation. So you're trying to gain credibility, right? That's the goal. And overall, I would say it was very positive. So I will not just be here saying this is perfect. There is going to be some place where I'll point out things that could be improved, or at least my opinion on those things. But overall, it's overwhelmingly positive. So just to give you an idea of what happens there at Pivotal, I mean, you know, they are very open culture, so you can actually go and sort of do a visit. But generally, they have this big room where everybody in Cloud Foundry gets together, and this is the stand-up. And typically, it's Matt, David, or James who run it. And they kind of get an idea of you know, is there anybody that want to share something? Is there a talk today? What's going to happen during the day? So basically an opportunity for everybody to get a chance to talk, you know, and sort of lay it out to everybody else. Then after that, you kind of go to your own team, and you kind of do the same, but this time specifically in a smaller setting, just with that team, and just also with the members of the team that, you know, essentially care for a particular part of the product. So for instance, I work with the Bosch team, so I would go to the stand-up of the Bosch team. And then if you work with the runtime team, you do the same, and so on. That's also after the stand-up where people pair. So the decision on pairing happens by the team. So typically, the product managers or the directors, if they are in the room, they actually leave, and the team decide on pairing. So there's always some kind of an anchor for the team, so sort of a team lead. He or she helps coordinate the pairing, but that happens by the team. And then, of course, you go start pairing. So an example, this is a picture of Rob and Dimitri pairing. They're part of the Bosch team, but that's typically what happened. You can see it's 2 computers with 2 keyboards, 2 monitors, sorry, but 1 actual computer. So there's 1 piece of code that's being written and worked on by 2 people at the same time. And as Julz mentioned, you will find it to be very weird if you've never done this before, but it's something you can learn very quickly. And it's extremely effective, and it's also very taxing because you have to constantly communicate, constantly share ideas, and you have to have some level of respect for your pair, because it doesn't work if you don't. And it doesn't work if you just want to take over the keyboard. It also doesn't work if you just want to sit down and let the other person take over the keyboard. So it's a constant communication, constant feedback. You learn from everybody. I've paired with, I can't say everybody at Pivotal, but a lot of people at Pivotal, and every single person I've paired with, I've learned something within a few hours. So it's a very, very effective fashion. It's just different, so you need to learn it. So when I did work with the runtime team, you know, it's a very important team. Generally, it was very chaotic to some extent because there's a lot happening. So it may not be the best first place to go, depending on what your intent is. But if you want to learn the internal of Cloud Foundry, the kernel, that's where you go. And this is where people like Matt and David can help you after you get an invitation, because they can kind of help you realize where you would better fit, and they'll help you make that decision. It's also not the best place to go if you want to learn about how to use Cloud Foundry, because you're essentially working on the kernel versus on applying the Cloud Foundry kernel to do something for you. The next team I worked on, it was the Bosch team, and they're under less pressure, but it's as important because it's essentially the foundation on how to set up Cloud Foundry. So a lot of people may find this to be very interesting to go to, because if your goal is to set up Cloud Foundry for your company, that may be a good place. There's a lot to be done, and it certainly has kind of its own language, I find. You know, learning Bosch is also about learning sort of how the Bosch team represents different parts of the Bosch environment, and using Bosch to deploy Cloud Foundry and other things. So this is certainly, you'll get an appreciation. If you don't understand Bosch right now, or you don't appreciate it, this is a good place. Of course, you could talk to Dr. Nick, and he'll convince you, but this is also a very good way to learn Bosch. Okay, so the other thing that happened is that we did get a chance to to talk to, at least in my case, I've tried to pair with other folks. I certainly give feedback to the directors and also Rob me. And what you find is that it's very open. It's a feedback welcoming culture. So they're always trying to adjust, and it's a great place to essentially go and embed yourself and learn. So the final part is to kind of look back. So, you know, looking back, I still work there half my week pretty much, and sometimes I embed myself to go do something with them. But generally, looking back, there are some things that we can think through and say, okay, what worked very, very well and what maybe could be improved. So first thing is, positively, I mean, I've not worked for any groups inside big company like IBM that I thought was as nice as Pivotal. I think there is I don't know if the directors or Rob me say that, oh, you need to be nice. If you're an asshole, you're going to get out of here. I don't know if they do that. They've never told me. But that's basically what I see, right? Everybody there is extremely nice, very welcoming. You can go talk to anybody. I've not had one person I tried to talk to that refused me. And at IBM, I have years of experience. I can point to a few of those. So, you know, different culture, but that's what it is. Clearly, there's a very stark mismatch. There are people at IBM like Rachel who's trying to change this to make IBM a little bit closer to Pivotal. I don't know if it's your case in your company, but I think you can learn a lot from them. You know, so, and I guess any small company, if you're coming from a big company. If you're a small company, maybe you'll see that they're a bit too big for you. But generally, I thought there's a mismatch, and we're trying to fix that. A very important thing is that decisions are made very, very quickly. So you want to talk to James Baer. He's usually there. He's meeting with customers all the time. But I've always had a chance, if I wanted to talk to him, to basically see him in the hallway and say, hey, James, can I talk to you about something? Or Matt, same thing. And they've usually, if they can't talk to me right now, they'll talk to you later. And when you're pairing, if you need to make a decision, you basically do the same. And that's how decisions are made, very, very quickly on the fly. So that's extremely important. As Julz mentioned, and we won't dwell on this, they just do Agile with a very high level of discipline. So if you want to learn this, this is a great place to do it. Their entire floor, second floor, is pretty much CF. So when you go there, it's pretty open. Most of the things happening there are not closed door. There are a few things, but generally it's open. You can discuss with anybody. And you know, pretty much for us to be able to contribute as much as we've done to Cloud Foundry and continue doing this and even accelerate it, it's going to require this embedding. And I think generally people are happy. How do you scale it? That's a problem, but generally it's the way to do it. So I would encourage you to consider the same. They don't really have schedule because you go by the backlog like James was talking about before today. But in some ways, it's all out there in the open, so this is kind of how it works. Whereas you contrast this with big companies where they usually have a set goal and a set date where they want things to be done. So these are the positive things. So what are the not so positive things? I hope I don't offend anybody, but I'll lay it out there. So first thing is, I think there's a lack of slack. And they're trying to fix this with things like having a little bit of hackathon to allow people to kind of explore things. But I find that unlike at IBM where I could create my own Slack, there's not a lot of Slack there. Because everything is in the backlog, you just work on them one after the other. The decisions are fast, but they are not data-driven, at least as far as I could see. Maybe it's changing, maybe Matt and the rest have lots of data that they cook and they decide on, I don't know. But at least I don't see it. Is it important to be data-driven? Probably to some extent not so much at this point, but as things get bigger, it might be interesting to have more data. And I know James mentioned before that there's a fair amount of, you know, he gets feedback and he takes pains, I guess he spends a lot of time thinking about that. And I think that's basically what I mean by this, is to make sure that we listen to the data and cook it and use it. Because of pairing, there's not a lot of documentation. And this is something that Julz mentioned. right? And it's a good thing and a bad thing, right? The good thing is there's tacit knowledge. It sort of floats around Pivotal, but it's at Pivotal, right? And of course, there's a fair amount of it in the, GitHub and READMEs and so on, but a lot of the knowledge is mostly at Pivotal. So if you go there and you pair, you'll be in that soup and you'll be happy. But if you're external, well, you got a problem. Now, of course, because it's open, at the end of the day, you can always read the code and figure it out, right? Use the source kind of deal. I've been programming Golang for the past 2 months, and I like it a lot. But I also know that it's not a panacea. And I'm not saying that people at Pivotal see it that way, but I think it's important to kind of remind ourselves this. It's like every other programming language, it solves a problem, it solves a particular space, but in some other cases, it may not be the best. I mean, Ruby does a very decent job for a lot of things. So I think that's something to remember. And then the other more subtle one is, I don't know if you've heard about the big ball of mud. It's, there's a researcher at, I guess, University of Illinois, Brian, who talk about this, which is that over time, all software become big balls of mud. And by that, it means that it becomes very hard. Entropy sets in. And I think it doesn't matter if you write it in Go, or you write it in Java, or write it in Ruby. It just so happens. When software is very big, it tends to happen. So I don't think moving to a different language will solve this. It's just a matter of like, when you get it the second time, you do it better, right? So that happens, right? And then, of course, TDD, while it's great, I love it. I mean, you can see I've written papers about TDD. It can be very much abused, and I've seen this at Pivotal. And they know that, okay? So a lot of this is not just brand new. I'm sure you talk to some folks at Pivotal, they tell you, we've been talking about this. But those are the realities. And to finish, I would highly recommend it, right? I mean, we both would highly recommend it. I know talking to Julz, he actually went through the Dojo program before me. And, we've only had very positive things generally to say about it. So if you're thinking about it or your engineers are thinking about it, you should definitely do it. You should practice TDD if you've never done this, and certainly pair programming, so that when you get there, it's not such a shock for you. Be ready to be nice. If you're thinking you're going to go there and take over, well, maybe that's not the right culture for you. So you want to learn that culture, embed yourself, try to be open, and be nice. So be like them, I guess, that, do that. And because very few places do Agile as much as Pivotal, think of it as an opportunity to learn. At least for me it was, and I think I speak for Julz as well. And continue adding to your company's credibility. So with that, we will stop and see if you have any questions. Thank you. We have 5 minutes, yes. When you write code as a pair? Ah, okay. Do you want to take this?
So there's a couple of ways. It used to be that you would sort of make the name, first name and second name, and then pick an email address with a tool called, I think, Git pair. But nowadays, there's one that I think is a bit better called Git duet. And that will set one of you to be the author of the commit and one of you to be the committer. And that way you both get a proper credit. And that's open source on GitHub. I think it's GitHub something duets. Yeah. But
like if you go to the commit on GitHub, you'll see both people's. There's one that's going to be selected to be the committer, but it's done, I think, in random fashion. So over time, there should be a balance where 50% will be committed on each. Any other questions? Yes. I didn't hear. Oh, okay. On the back? Sorry. Yeah, go ahead. How can you do extreme pair programming? Oh, from remote location. Okay. You're remote?
Yeah, so it's sometimes challenging. The ideal thing for pair programming is to be in the same room. That is clear. There are ways around it. So there are tools. One that I've used a lot is Screen Hero, which is awesome, which gives you sort of a screen share. So you're both sort of on the same screen. And each of you can type and use your mouse on the same screen. There's other ones. You can use Tmux to share a Vim session. It's not as good as being in the same room, but you can set up your iPad next to your screen with a Skype or a Hangout so you get a bit of visual contact. You can have meetups like this, which really help so that you can meet the people that you're pairing with. Having gone through the dojo, you know a few of the people a bit more, which gives you a little bit of rapport when you then pair with people. I think it's things like that. There isn't a perfect answer. I'm not sure that pairing is something that is ever going to be as good in a remote context, but you can make it work. And me and Michael were pairing a lot of last week, and it's completely possible to pair remotely. The biggest thing actually is time zones. Time zones more than anything else are what hurt, because I'm 8 hours out, so that's painful.
The only thing I would add to this is I've not remotely paired, so certainly Julz has the experience and some other people here, but I can tell you when you go to Pivotal, if you do a visit, especially during the time when the hours people are working and pairing, if you walk around, you'll see a few people with another screen and nobody else next to them. And usually they are basically remote pairing. So Pivotal itself does remote pairing with, I think, teams from Boulder and teams even from New York and other places. So, you know, your mileage will vary, but it happens. Okay? Any other questions? Ah, yes. You shout. How do you decide who works on the keyboard? Right. So this is something, I think the culture. So how do you decide who's on the keyboard versus? Yes, yeah. So the question was, how do you decide when you're pairing who's on the keyboard versus who's not on the keyboard and vice versa?
I'm on the keyboard.
Yeah, exactly. So it's kind of the way we're trying to do this presentation here, where I say something and I guess Julian interjected. And you have to be good at, I guess this is also maybe why the culture there is to be nice, because clearly if you're dominating the keyboard, it's going to be a problem, right, for your pair. And they will have to stop and say, well, you know, maybe let me jump in. So, you know, part of the idea of pairing is to make sure that everybody gets a chance to work as one, but essentially as a team, a small micro team during that time. So typically what happens for me is that I get to learn the person's personality and the way they like to work very quickly within, let's say, half a day. And I tend to try to adjust from it. But generally, it's you work on something, you spend some time, well, maybe you do the test, and then the other person does the code, or you do the code and the other person does the test. You kind of do that. That's maybe a good way to start. The other way is to essentially, you know, ask for it. So do you want to add something? Sure.
I think what you find is there's like some patterns for doing it, right? Like some people do a pattern where one of you's the driver and one of you's the navigator and things like this. But normally, if it's working well, that goes away. Right? Those are sort of stabilizers for your bike, right? You can start out with one of these patterns. Maybe one of you writes a unit test, one of you writes the code, and you go back and forth. But once you get into it, I think you pretty much almost always find that you get into just a rhythm where it's kind of clear. You know, someone's got an idea, because you're talking all the time. I think that the thing that strikes you most about pairing, or at least struck me most, actually the thing that struck me most since not pairing for a while, after going back, is you really miss having someone to talk to. Because what you end up doing is having this conversation. What do you think is the best way of doing this? What do you think is how we might do this? And because it's not I'm typing, there's a lot of talking going on and a lot of communication. And in that context, it becomes clear, you know, I'm going to write this, because there's that conversation. And the conversation doesn't need, you know, in a conversation, say, how do you know who talks at what time in a conversation, right? It's clear in the context of a conversation who talks next.
Excellent. Okay, maybe last question and we'll finish. Rachel? Right. So the question was, can you comment on the productivity of working in pairs versus not working in pairs? I'll be brief, and then get you a chance to chime in. So when I did my PhD, I worked for one of the person that actually essentially did her PhD on that, the whole pairing, Laurie Williams. So I'll give her a quick thing. So if you don't know her, you can Google her, Laurie Williams, at North Carolina State University. And one of the things that she came up on her PhD was that productivity, there's some difference, but generally it's negligible, generally. Partly because there's so much constant feedback that the quality of the code is much better. There's less need for documentation, so therefore you can kind of remove this. So overall, things kind of smoothen out when it comes to productivity. So it's not like you get half the productivity. You actually get as much productivity as two people doing it separately because they end up having much more bugs and other issues. So you want to take a look at that. My personal experience was that I've not had, I mean, partly because there's also not a lot of pressure on schedule, that I find that we would cook up, 2 or 3 points sometimes per day pairing. And so for me, this is just as much I would do by myself. Because there's a constant person there to discuss, I find that I slack less, which, again, I was saying we need more Slack, but it's also bad when you have a lot of Slack, especially email, right? You spend a lot of time doing email. I mean, it's ridiculous, right? You should be coding, and the other person helps you, reminds you. So personally, I find it to be, as productive, if not more productive than when I'm by myself.
Right. I think that's exactly right. I think you find you work much harder in practice in the day. The reality is you're checking Twitter less, right? Because there's someone pairing with you. What's more, I think because you're working at this constant pace, 9 to 5 each day, you're getting a lot done in those 9 to 5s. The only thing I would say is there is an extent to which I think there is a psychology of some people which is a lot more suited to not working that hard for 3 or 4 days and then working really hard, pushing something out and doing that sort of, it's sprints versus marathons, right? And there's a lot to be said for that sustainable marathon pace that you get with pairing. You know exactly what you're getting, you're delivering at a constant pace. But I've certainly written something sometimes where it came, you get passionate about something, and there's a thing that I really want to build, and now I'm going to really go and build that. And I think that's sometimes a bit harder in a pair programming context, but I'm not sure that's the difference between the productivity of the two so much as the psychology of it. And it may be just that I find it enjoyable to do those sort of big sprints. You feel really great about yourself that, I'm so hardcore, right? I pushed through this thing. But I don't know that I was actually more productive than I would have been at that sustainable pace. So I certainly think you get some very high quality code on a pretty regular basis with it. So.
Okay, with that, time's up. So thank you for coming. We'll be here.